I'm pretty sure most people are familiar with the term impossible crime. In Detective Conan, it's generally used to describe events such as a crime within a locked room. You can also learn just how many ways there are to kill people, such as using the cracks of a door, vents, and the like within this situation. If it's considered an impossible crime because of the position of the door or perhaps the keys after the crime, then I've committed countless crimes when I was a child by sneaking into my parents' room to play on the computer. To put it bluntly, it's pretty much using science to explain any non-scientific events, which is the point of this type of detective story. But this case within Detective Conan is an unexplainable case whether from a supernatural or rational point of view. Going back to the moment when the case was happening, the police had the same attitude towards this case as they did 2 years ago, as a suicide. It's practically impossible to carry a person of the abbot's body size onto the beam and make it look like a suicide. If one were to use the principle of levers to lift him up, then it would definitely leave traces of the rope being dragged on the beam. Thus, the possibility of going up from below can be ruled out first. Then, what about going in through the window next to the beam? It's a pity that the size of the window and the width of the crossbeam are quite narrow, which is just enough space for an adult to barely enter. Not to mention, it also lacks a support point to pull people up that are below. It would be extremely difficult to climb to the middle of the beam while carrying a person with you. In addition, the dust accumulated besides the beams didn't change much. Thus, a homicide can basically be ruled out. Inspector Megaray's deduction so far is reasonable. The only thing he can't figure out is the motive of the abbot's suicide and the origin of the big hole in the wall. His explanation for this is that the deceased was imitating past legends and myths while committing suicide to add a sense of mystery behind his death, while Conan's focus was not on the wall itself, but on the falling debris from the wall. Compared with the broken hole, the number of debris on the floor was meager. If one really were to imitate Kiritengu and break the wall to kill people, then one should have removed all the debris by throwing it under the temple or maybe putting it inside the room. The behavior of randomly putting a few pieces outside like this was really puzzling. At this time, the family of the victim came to the scene. She was the granddaughter of the host and the prospective girlfriend of Conan who had died 2 years ago. During the past 2 years, the person she loved and her grandfather had passed away one after another. She could only cry on the shoulders of her newly married husband. The Buddhist disciples believed that Conan committed suicide because he heard that the woman he loved was going to marry her fiancé, while the host had been regretting the incident 2 years ago and had finally chosen to kill himself after his granddaughter got married. Now all the clues were connected in one line, and everyone dispersed to find that suicide note that the host might have left behind. Only Conan stood there thinking, even if everything is as Inspector Megaray had deduced, the pre-death composure of the deceased was too far-fetched in contrast with his suicide motive. His attitude yesterday was nothing like a man who was regretting his past and contemplating suicide. If whoever that person was really killed him, then it's probable that the murderer is the same person from 2 years ago. It was useless to stand still and think about it. Conan decided to confirm everyone's alibi. He first set his target on the youngest, Conan, who was the least suspected criminal. He came to the temple a year ago and had nothing to do with the previous case. He was so thin that he wouldn't be able to break the wall alone. Adding on to that, according to Conan's principle, the younger the suspect is, the less likely they are to kill someone. Conan, who was only 18 years old, is the best person to question. Conan asks him if he heard anyone leave their rooms or make loud noises when he was studying at night. But they were overruled by Conan, who didn't hear any movement until 3 o'clock in the morning while he was studying. Conan turned to the window of the dark room to investigate and found that the floor soaked by the waterfall had a broken mark from a long time ago. When he lifted it up, he found that there were many neatly arranged, fresh cherry blossom petals behind it. He then went down below the temple to find pieces of the broken wall, and on the other side, a pair of hideous eyes were staring at Conan's defenseless back. Soon, Conan found one of the fragments, strangely covered with a piece of duct tape. A hand suddenly grabbed Conan, and Ron once again won the game of hide-and-seek with Conan. The shadowy figure quietly left. Conan returned to the scene, reassessing all the suspicious points. The broken wall, the sawed board, and the wall fragments with tape. There must be some connection between these pieces. At this time, a cherry blossom petal floated in from the window of the dark room and landed on Conan's nose. Fortunately, this was in the early days of Detective Conan, as the rhinoceros-nosed Conan in the later stages of the anime might make a hole through the petal. In any case, this petal was the same as the petals attached to the back of the sawn-off plank. Lightning flashed through his head, and the MO was finally deduced. This method could be executed by any Buddhist disciple as long as they had enough time. Even so, the real criminal accidentally revealed the fact that he was the murderer. Next up, it was time for Sleeping Kogoro's deduction show. attracting Uncle Mori to the window of the dark room in order to tranquilize him, but instead him slipping, hitting the back of his head, and passing out. Conan, who witnessed this, not only didn't send Mori to the hospital, but also put the front of his unconscious body by the window to continue the deduction. If it weren't for your future father-in-law's superhuman HP Conan, I think you'd be charged with attempted murder. This time, the culprit took advantage of the blind spots of people's thinking. Most people would think that it's impossible to climb to such a high beam and hang a rope with the weight of another person, with most giving priority to the thought that people would most likely come in through the window. But the culprit did it anyway, and he floated to the beam like a Kiritengu to take advantage of the unique geographical environment of this temple. He first put the dead host onto the rubber boat and unveiled the water from the waterfall into the room. When the water accumulated to a sufficient height, it was enough to hang the corpse on the beam. A cloth was specially placed on the corpse to prevent it from being wet from the splashing water. As for how to bring in the water, he relied on the two tools of a wooden board and tape. He put the boards at the right distance upside down to allow water to pass through, as well as taped the gap between the small door and the boards in the room to keep the water leakage rate to a minimum. The pedals on the board were stuck together when the tape was attached. Considering the water consumption, this room is 2.7 meters in length and width, with about 10 meters in height. Thus, it takes about 72.9 tons of water to fill this room. After the room filled up, they went out through the window and went to the small door that was sealed with tape, before giving it a blow with an axe. Under this tremendous pressure, the water would break through the doors directly, leaving a huge hole, and most of the debris would fly out, along with the pressured water. Calculating according to the speed of the entering water, it would take at least 7 hours to accumulate that much water. The time of the host's death was from 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. yesterday, and the body was found at 8 a.m. in the morning. In other words, the murderer stayed in the same room with the corpse all night, accompanied by the sound of loud running water to keep the rubber boat balanced. Before revealing the culprit's mask, Conan first asked Shunen a question. Before he went to bed at 3 a.m. today, did he hear any sounds, like a human screaming or something? Shunen, who had previously claimed that it was a quiet night, panicked and argued that he did hear someone screaming, and that it came from Ron. It's a damn shame, because if it was in other cases, his deduction would be correct. But today at 2 a.m., it was our Uncle Mori who was scared by the mask and screamed. No wonder he couldn't hear it. After all, he was staying in a small room with the host's corpse and enjoying the wonderful sound of the waterfall coming in. However, this answer can only prove that he didn't hear any sound at that point in time. Most people would have done such things as lying to others that they were studying while they were actually sleeping, as long as they don't leave behind fatal evidence. However, the fingerprints affixed to the tape on the wood plank were the perfect evidence. The culprit originally planned to regain all the planks while the others were searching for the suicide note, and to his surprise, Conan had got to one of them. Faced with this irreparable situation, Shunen finally confesses to the crime and his motives. His real identity is as Chunen's biological younger brother, who had died 2 years ago. He was puzzled by his brother's death, so he deliberately changed his name and surname to sneak into the temple in order to investigate. It took 6 months to roughly understand the method of the crime, but the true identity of the murderer was still unknown. It was only confirmed after witnessing the abbot's attitude at dinner yesterday. After that, he purposely came to the abbot's room to please him, and under the influence of alcohol, he revealed his motive for killing. It turned out that his granddaughter was engaged to the heir of a big temple 2 years ago, but she fell in love with Chunen and planned to elope. The host killed him the same way as mentioned before, disguising the whole thing as a Kiritengu incident in order to increase the popularity of the temple. The kind Shunen advised the host to turn himself into the trial of the law, even though he knew the facts. However, the host rejected this proposal because he had no evidence to testify about the crime committed 2 years ago. Shunen lost his mind, killed the abbot, and reproduced the scene from 2 years ago. The murderer then confessed and wished that if only they could have visited this temple 2 years prior. Generally speaking, this episode is considered to be a very exciting episode of Detective Conan during the early days. It's scary, mysterious, and a little funny, with there being few cases that use physics knowledge in order to solve them. However, there are still many loopholes within this case. Firstly, where in the hell would one buy this board? The structure of this entire temple is semi-suspended, and this wooden plank had been kept together by the water from the waterfall for so many years, while not being damp and moldy at all, as well as being able to bear such a huge and enormous weight. Is the speed of leakage ignored when calculating the time it takes water to fill the room? Or is the plank and tape nearly 100% leak-proof? This has broken through the cognition of material science. In addition, several other Buddhist disciples were frightened by Mori's screams and didn't fall asleep. while they apparently didn't hear the sound of the wall breaking and water rushing out at the speed and sound of a high-speed truck, etc. At the end of the episode, Mori and the others were able to go down the mountain in a police car. The police completed their mission quota for the day, the murderer succeeded in their revenge, the temple could arrange the funeral at will, and everything ended like this. It's worth noting that between the time Conan found out about the crack on the plank, and by the time he knew the real culprit, he had known a while ago that the culprit this time was not the same as the culprit from 2 years ago. According to the abbot's attitude towards that matter, there was a high possibility that he was the murderer 2 years ago. So before revealing the truth, Conan specifically asks about his granddaughter's location. He didn't want her to know the cruel reality that it was her grandfather who had killed the person she loved. It's a pity that this time, the murderer did not meet Sherlock Holmes as a person, but Edogawa Conan as a detective. The righteous detective. The gentle god of death, casting down his merciless judgment.